From eye color to accents, humans have a lot of variations. Many of them are obvious and used as a way of expressing individuality. But there are some major ones that many of us never realize, which are called hidden differences. How we think is considered to be one of these variable factors. Most of us assume that what's going on inside our own heads is the same as the person next to us. But Dr. Gary Lupien says we only assume that because there's not an obvious way to compare how we think.
We know that some people can run really fast. We get a lot of observation, and people are kind of well calibrated. They know kind of how fast they run compared to others. We don't have the same type of access to other people's mental states. And so we don't know how much inner speech someone experiences or how much visual imagery one experiences. We can talk about it. We can compare notes. So it's stuff that we can reflect on, we can talk about. And then people are shocked to discover that, oh, these things differ.
Lupien is a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His lab has been investigating the mind's inner voice. We all have one, right? Not so much. While there's not a ton of research on it just yet, it's believed that a person's inner voice exists on a spectrum, from someone who's constantly talking in their head to a person who doesn't hear any voice at all. And though there's been no real evidence that can point to what contributes to where each one of us lands on the spectrum, Lupien thinks it may be a combination of genetic predisposition and the culture you were raised in.
Inner speech, we know, does develop. It has a developmental trajectory. So before you learn, as a child, before you learn language, there's no inner speech. But then just based on observation of kids, some kids talk to themselves out loud quite a bit and others less so.
We don't yet know if these observations in childhood remain the same as people get older. But Lupien says that it is pretty consistent over small amounts of time, like 6 months. Culture is the other factor that he believes could be an important influence.
To what extent is even speaking out loud to yourself kind of tolerated, encouraged, or is it seen as kind of abnormal behavior? One can view silent inner speech as in the same category as actually talking out loud to yourself, right? And so if you have an environment where talking out loud to yourself is encouraged, one might predict that there would be more silent inner speech overall.
While that's still a hypothesis, we do know that people with more inner speech also tend to have more visual imagery. That connection has led Lupien to assume that the opposite is also true.
And so what that means is that you have some people who report experiencing neither, right? So they don't really form visual images. They don't really have much inner speech. And so then the question arises, like, what does thinking feel like to them? We have collected some self-report data on this, and many people report thinking in various spatial terms. So space is not visual. It's a more general thing, right? So people come up with all kinds of spatial ways of categorizing things, of sequencing things.
For example, one participant in Lupien's research said that they categorize information by placing the data into mental buckets.
And these places don't need to have names, right? You don't need to visualize them. You don't need to visualize a bucket, right? It's a more abstract way of organizing information.
Another way to understand how differently people think is through mental math.
So you can give them a problem and then have them kind of think aloud protocol. And there's a whole range of ways people do this. And it for sure is informed by how they were taught in school. But people on their own come up with all kinds of little shortcuts and things that they don't really think about or consider, like, how common is it? Does everyone do this?
The researchers were initially inspired to use this method by a post on the internet, where the user wrote that they tap their teeth as a way to help them add up numbers.
This is something that would never, I think, occur to a math cognition person studying like mental arithmetic, that this is a strategy that people come up with. But it's a nonverbal thing, right? It's just they're tapping their teeth to kind of remember, where, carry the one and so on. And there is just such a diversity of these types of strategies and just ways of solving problems, right? That until you start exploring the space, it just doesn't occur to you.
These type of experiments show that there's a whole spectrum of strategies that people use every day without realizing how unique they may be. which makes it an exciting research path. Unfortunately, it can be challenging to study since describing how you think can be difficult to put into words.
Not surprisingly, if someone experiences a lot of inner speech, you ask them, well, how are you thinking? They have a ready-made answer. It's like, well, it's kind of like I speak. So I use words in my mind. I sequence them into sentences. For someone who reports not really using language, it, not surprisingly, is harder to talk about because we don't really have the vocabulary to talk about these sorts of spatial transformations of meaning. But I think one productive research area is, again, focusing on behavioral tasks and understanding, okay, here is a range of tasks that become easier if you kind of think about them in a more verbal-like way. Here are some tasks that would become harder if you think about it in a more verbal-like way, but maybe easier if you spatialize them.
And based on the results, the researchers will be able to start pinpointing characteristics of people with more or less inner voice. As you can imagine, studying this phenomenon has been slow work. Russ Hurlburt has been a pioneer of researching the inner experience of humans. But since most of this work is based on self-reports, it can be tricky to get accurate data.
And you have people who say, oh yeah, I talk to myself all the time, but then it turns out that, well, it's actually much rarer than that when you actually probe it in more detail. So it's a subjective phenomenon. And so one has to kind of trust people's self-report in one way or another. And that's not that different from other kinds of subjective things, right? So if we want to know whether someone is in pain, we ask them. We trust their response.
However, there are certain methods that are better than others. For example, you can use different experiments as a way to validate the self-reports.
If someone is talking about tapping their teeth, right, a straightforward prediction is that like putting a pen in their mouth would get in the way of them solving math problems. And until you know that there are people who do this, it wouldn't occur to you to run that kind of experiment. If someone is using space to kind of put things into different categories, you can have them do the task while they have to hold something spatial in memory and kind of putting a memory load on spatial memory. And you would expect that it would interfere with their performance of the task, but not with someone who is doing it in a more language-focused way. So those are the kinds of experiments you can do to tease that apart. So it's always good if that subjective report predicts other things. And so this recent paper does that with inner speech. So it doesn't just show that, oh, there are these differences in self-reports. It also tries to show that, and these differences predict certain behaviors, certain performance on various cognitive tasks.
Lupyan's recent paper, published in Psychological Science, used similar experiments to try and see if not having an inner voice has an effect on individual performance. There were 2 tasks that revealed a clear difference in performance for those who don't have much inner speech. The first test asked participants to remember certain words.
It's well known that when people are asked to remember a series of words, they tend to rehearse the sounds of those words, so-called phonological memory. And so a straightforward prediction is that someone who experiences less inner speech might be less likely to do that and as a result have worse memory. And so that's what we found. So people with less inner speech had a harder time remembering these words.
However, if participants chose to repeat the words out loud, they performed the same as the group with a strong inner voice. The second experiment asked both groups to quickly decide if 2 different objects rhymed.
See a picture of a box and a fox. Do these things rhyme? And we found the same pattern that people overall with less inner speech were worse at the task, but if they spoke out loud to themselves, their performance was at the same level as people with typical inner speech. And again, for those with typical inner speech, it didn't matter.
It's important to keep in mind that while this study shows consistent results, Lupyan says there's no evidence that a lack of inner voice is associated with deficits across the board.
One can come up with tasks where the prediction is flipped, where they would be expected to perform better. So, for example, when phonological activation gets in the way, which sometimes happens during reading certain words, you'd expect people with less inner speech to do better. There is also, in other work, we found that often people with more inner speech are slower without being more accurate. Language in general can be quite slow compared to other ways of thinking.
In fact, people who think spatially are often better suited for certain careers, like math-based professions, than those who think with language.
This isn't just mathematicians. We were looking at research psychologists who tend to use more mathematical methods, mathematical models, compared to those who use less. There's a difference in spatial imagery there. So people who use mathematical models tend to have higher spatial imagery. It's kind of this remarkable thing where, because people self-segregate, right? So if you're a mathematician, you tend to hang out with other mathematicians. If on average in that group there's less inner speech, then you're even more sure that this is just the way the human mind is. It doesn't occur to you that most people have this kind of running monologue inside their head. And for what it's worth, doing this research, I realized that I have less inner speech than most people. Like, I thought I was just average in this regard. And, then I see all these people completing questionnaires and just, giving the highest rating across the board on, endorsing all of this running commentary and all. And it was kind of shocking, because I'm like, really? This is just how it is for all you guys?
Humans tend to assume that our personal perceptions of the world line up with everyone else's, but that's usually not the case.
It's fun to compare notes. I mean, what we've noticed in doing this type of work is that people have often a very strong belief that how they experience the world is generally aligned with that of other people. And in cases where it's difficult to observe those differences directly, we just don't know until we find out.
So while he continues this research, Lupien also encourages all of us to start comparing notes about our own inner speech with friends and family in order to uncover more of these hidden differences. You can find more information about Dr. Gary Lupien and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.